So I've spent the last 8 years or so working on climate change policy in one form or another. And I began my career in the Rudd-Gillard years as a lawyer working for one of the big firms in Australia. And I was advising some of Australia's biggest companies on the various iterations of carbon pricing policy and legislation that emerged from the turbulent climate politics of this period. Now, through this experience, I became convinced that the biggest challenge we face in responding to climate change is not so much about the kind of rational design of optimal climate change policy by technocratic experts. It's actually a much deeper challenge relating to our political institutions and the way they interact with our economy and what this means for our ability as a society to manage change. So I want to relay an episode from this period which illustrates these problems and that inspired my current research. So like all big reforms, climate change policy and carbon pricing involves winners and losers among companies, individuals, sectors, you name it. And some of the biggest losers, or the biggest losers, certainly the loudest in Australia from climate policy, were the handful of companies that own Australia's most polluting coal-fired power stations in the Latrobe Valley. Now, these companies ran a disciplined and ruthless campaign to undermine the carbon pricing schemes of Rudd and Gillard that combined public advertising with hysterical threats of price hikes and blackouts and economic chaos with a sophisticated backroom lobbying effort to extract as much compensation as possible from the government. This campaign exposed bitter divisions within the government itself about how to respond to this issue and whether they were entitled to compensation or not. The government didn't have a coherent principled position, and so it just kind of made these arbitrary promises of compensation, which led to ever escalating demands from industry and even bigger promises of compensation, detailed in that book. Ultimately, the Gillard carbon pricing scheme allocated $5.5 billion to this small handful of companies. And this transfer of wealth, extraordinary scale of wealth, transferred from the public purse to the nation's biggest polluters, had a number of effects. It undermined support for the scheme, even among environmental groups and the wider public. But at the same time, the lack of transitional assistance for workers and communities in the Latrobe Valley and other affected areas also bred hostility in these communities, some of whom could have been brought on board with the reforms if the transitional issues were handled differently. So this all got me thinking about the larger questions of how we should handle these transitional issues in big reforms. I mean, should we be giving compensation at all, or should we be giving compensation to all the losers? Or some of them, and if so, which ones, and on what grounds do we distinguish? Is it really even all about just compensation, or is it also about, the loss of status and cultural identity that communities and individuals feel in these processes of transition? So perhaps it's also about recognition and respect and participation in processes of change that affect people's lives. These are all important normative questions in their own right. But they also, as we've seen, they have political consequences. Whether there's a coherent, justified and fair approach to policy transition can make the difference between the success or failure of policy reforms. And so, in my PhD, I plan to develop a set of general principles that governments and citizens can apply to deal with the transitional aspects of major reforms. And I plan to develop and invoke a notion of responsible citizenship as the basis for distinguishing between worthy and unworthy losers and winners from reforms. So for example, we could ask whether a reasonably politically engaged company buying coal-fired power generators in the late 90s could reasonably have foreseen that climate change regulation would reduce the value of those assets. And I think that kind of principle would have precluded compensation in the Rudd-Gillard years, and also can provide a basis for some compensation or assistance to workers and communities. But to fully operationalise these principles, we also need to think about reforms to our democratic institutions, to equip governments and citizens to manage and deliberate about policy change in an efficient, effective and just way. And so to do that, I'm going to be drawing, in developing these principles and institutional recommendations, on traditions of thought including Republican political philosophy, virtue ethics and deliberative democracy. Now, I'm a big believer that ideas can change the world, but they don't do so on their own. It requires advocacy and engagement. And that's part of the reason why part of my PhD will involve case applications where I can test the principles and institutional reforms that I develop. One will be on climate policy and the other will be on inequality reducing reform in the form of a wealth tax. And in this way, I hope that my inevitably relatively narrow project about transitional justice can connect to a wider global project of democratic revival that's inspiring communities around the globe who are fed up with the interaction between our politics and economic systems in contemporary liberal democracies. So let me conclude with this thought, that the 21st century is going to involve accelerating changes in technology, economics and society, creating extreme risks and profound opportunities. But if we want to build and maintain a good society, then we're going to need also to frequently change our laws and policies. And that means our political institutions need to be fit for a world of rapid change. But if the politics of change continues much as it has done over the last decade, the decade that brought us the reform fiascos of the carbon tax, the mining super profits tax, and Tony Abbott, then I really fear for our nation in the next 5 or 10 years, let alone in 30 years' time. I believe we can do better. But to do better, we need to think big picture and long term about the very democratic institutions that condition the politics of policy reform. Thanks very much.